Okay, and we are live. Welcome to this panel, this discussion between myself and Rob Davis, aka the Swamper. It's being streamed live to my YouTube account. It was suggested by someone in the RPG Brigade. I highly recommend you go and check that out if you have an interest in tabletop RPGs. And we're just going to be chatting a little bit about the importance of cooperation in tabletop RPGs and how you can encourage that a little bit in your game. Now, the live chat for this video should be open, so if anyone has any questions in that, feel free to submit them. Otherwise, myself and Rob are just going to have a little bit of a chat about this subject until we feel we've exhausted it, and then we'll finish the broadcast. Hopefully this will be the first of a number of these sort of chats that we'll be having, and we'll be broadcasting just so people can get a more sort of informal view of what our views are on various subjects about role plays. Okay, so first of all, do we think cooperation's actually important in RPGs? Let's establish that before we start. I don't know about yourself, Rob. How important do you think it is in RPGs?
Well, I mean, the PCs agree, but cooperation is made. You know, you, the players, and the GM collectively are telling a story and having an adventure. How do you do that if everyone's going in 5 different directions? You can't.
That's
so
it.
Yes,
I mean,
it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I do agree, and I think that as well, outside of the sort of IC benefits of it, and obviously the fact everyone's gathered around to tell a story, at the end of the day, regardless of anything else in RPGs, role-playing games are a social activity. As you've said, you're gathering around with a group of other people and your GM, your other players, ostensibly to all contribute to a session, to all ensure that everyone playing and the GM has a good time and has an enjoyable role-playing experience whilst you're playing the game.
It's also a basic rule of improvisation, cooperation drama classes, and if 2 people are on stage and they're improvising, they have to play off one another, right? Even if it's kind of arguing a point of view on a subject within character, they're still cooperating because they're listening and responding to what the other person is saying, right? And collectively, they're making a scene, right? So they're building something. The 2 actors are cooperating to build a scene. So it's still cooperation, even if there's a character disagreement.
Yeah, we've just had our first question come in on the chat box from Tales from Another World, and he's asking, would you consider cooperative roleplay as a form of positive metagaming? Now, I know me and yourself were talking about this a short while ago, Rob, and without all the sort of negative connotations that tend to come with metagaming, there is which is taking actions outside of your character knowledge or for other motivations outside of your character's immediate motivations. I do think there is a positive side to it. After all, if you have a certain outcome in mind, which let's say is bringing a new player into the group or a new character into the group, there are numerous different ways that you can react to do that within the bounds of your character's established behavior without having to step outside it. I don't know what you think about that, Rob.
Yeah, I agree. Basically, I don't like to call it metagaming. I'm going to use a term that Same OG, I think, first coined. I don't want to take credit. Called player awareness. Good player awareness. This is not metagaming, where metagaming you correctly defined as using knowledge that the player should have. Rather, this is player awareness. So, not like maybe a director who's watching a play. Even as a player, even playing in character, between lines, maybe you notice that of the 3 other players, one of them has been quiet for 10 minutes. So good player awareness would be concocting a reason for your character to speak to their character, right? And that way you bring the player into the scene so that their character and that player get some screen time. So yeah, I call it good player awareness, and being aware of, well, that guy hasn't spoken in 10 minutes. How can my character get his character into the scene, right? So you think of a way that you might connect, disagree, argue, have to ask him about something, whatever, and then you say to him in character something which causes him to respond, and he's into the scene.
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, I think even if it's as simple as a scene where, let's say, all the, just to use a stereotypical sort of D&D scene, just because it's something everyone's familiar with, if all the player characters are sat around in a tavern, let's say, and they're discussing what they're about to do on the next mission, and as you rightly say, Rob, you notice that one of the players maybe it isn't getting involved in the conversation. Now, that could be for any number of reasons. Maybe they just, maybe they haven't thought about it, or maybe they didn't want to butt in, or maybe they're a little bit unsure of themselves. Without putting anyone on the spot, it's not really stepping outside your character to turn to that person and say, oh, what do you reckon we should do? And then straight away, they don't have to respond, but you've just given them that opening where if maybe they were taking a step back because of like, oh, well, I don't really want to butt in, I don't want to seem rude, I'm not really sure about the etiquette of the situation. You've given them that opening where they can come in and say, oh, well, my character thinks that we should do this, or we should seek out some more information or whatever. And you've just given them that little bit of a sort of nudge to get themselves involved in the scene without really putting them directly on a spot.
Yeah, quite right. Instead of the GM having to fall back on the old, the player in character, Ordis, how do you think we should approach this? Right? And then the character can, without breaking character, respond, and the GM doesn't have to do that sort of nudging, emergent cracking, what are you doing, player? Because you're staying right within the scene, these characters in a conversation discussing them. So yeah, good player awareness is very important to player cooperation. It can certainly help with player cooperation. As a Vince tip, if you've been playing in a campaign for a while with a character, maybe you've learned something, a little tidbit about that background. So maybe in a quiet time, the players are traveling, they're stopped overnight somewhere outdoors, and your character says to that character as a way of getting them in the conversation, you mentioned this village you grew up in that had some strange, seer. Tell me of this person. Tell me of your family. Something like that. Anything that will elicit a response from that character and bring that player into the team.
No, and I think you raise a very good point there, where a lot of it is about player awareness and the players taking some responsibility for that part of the game, rather than leaving it all to the GM to consistently sort of alternate between people and say, right, well, you've not spoken for a bit, what are you doing now? Right, what are you doing now? Which, as you say, if you're in a nice flow of a conversation and it's all in character, can be quite jarring and can sort of break the pace of that scene. Where if it's someone in character who's actually involved in that conversation, just like in character turning to someone else and saying, oh, what do you reckon? Then it's still keeping that pace going, but because the player's being aware of, oh, this person's not spoke for a bit, they can bring them in using an in-character method without someone having to step out of character to facilitate that.
Yeah, often in groups you'll have players that are more passive than other players, tend to be more quiet. A couple of players going to become the de facto spokesperson for the party. They do a lot of the talking to the NPCs, negotiating. And sometimes you might want to try, if you are one of those non-passive, there's one of those people who does a lot of the talking. I tend to be in games. Try and look for ways to bring the other players in. So let me give you an example of this once. I was a player with 3 others. Me and another player, we were pretty active. We did a lot of the talking. The other 2 players didn't do too much talking. We're in a town. There was a murder mystery we were investigating, and we were in a tavern, and we had to go question a witness. And I was playing dwarf, and we happened to know that this character wasn't terribly fond of dwarves. So I said to the other active player, the non-passive one, I said something along the lines of, well, she's not too crazy about dwarves. Why don't we let these 2 go talk to her and question the witness? Basically taking us 2 out of the scene so that those 2 got to, the passive players got to do a scene where they had to do all the talking. So even though I was actually splitting the party, I was actually helping those other 2 players get some more screen time, because I know they were quiet, by taking us out of the scene, me and the other active player. And it worked out well. The other 2 players went and they did the interview and they got some more screen time. And so that's another way you do it. You know, you can say even something simple like, "Oh, you talk to him, right? I'm too angry."
Yeah, that's a nice in-character way of keeping the situation going, but achieving the ends that you're looking for as a player, which is to bring someone else into the scene without having to come up with some artificial or out of character means of actually doing something. That's a very good example of that. So if we both agree that we think cooperation is important for the various reasons we've just described, I think another very good reason it's important to have that level of cooperation is because that's whole sort of like loner character is not really connected to any other members of the group. You know, the sort doesn't really have any connections to the campaign world. They're that sort of gritty loner who drives through the night on their own with only their trusty katana and their motorbike as company. They don't really need anyone else. It's a very one-dimensional character that's not particularly interesting. I mean, to a certain extent, we're all influenced by our relationships in real life with other people. That's part of what defines who we are, how we behave towards other people, how they behave towards us, etc. So I think actually having that cooperation and building that rapport with other characters not only helps by bringing them into the game, it also helps to define your own character more and sort of set their place in the campaign world.
Yes. Further to that point, when you're creating a character, don't create anything. There are certain things you shouldn't create just because those things aren't well suited to group play. Like you say, if your character is like, I'm the loner type who never talks to anybody, he's quiet, brooding all the time, well then how are you going to, why is this guy adventuring with a group of people then? If he's that type, why isn't he out doing his own adventure, right? So you need to create a character who's at least suitable to being with others, right? And please don't create a guy that likes to screw around the pump and fuck them over and do it. Don't create that guy. It's a co-op game, all right? They're just going to fire you and dump. So always create a co-op character. That doesn't mean you can't create a brooding type character, but you can't make him so aloof that he would be traveling with a group. That in your character creation, that can lead to that co-op.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's also, we talked about earlier, possibly the moments when you're maybe not directly involved in the action that's going on. You can still carry on your IC conversations. If there's one or two other characters who aren't directly involved in the scene, you can, as long as you're not disturbing the main game, you can maybe chat to them in character. Like if you guys have been left behind in the tavern or whatever while the other people have gone to get some information, carry on the conversation IC in the tavern. Now, if you're doing a face-to-face game, there's no reason you can't just step aside and talk a bit more quietly so you're not interrupting like the main game. If it's an online game, there's the various sort of chat box apps and things like that, or jumping onto Facebook chat or something like that. Obviously not ideal, but you can still carry on a bit of conversation rather than just sort of sitting there and being in pause mode until the spotlight swings back to you. And that all helps foster that idea that your characters are working as a group and helps start to build those relationships between the different characters, which can pay off further down the line.
Yes, and you can still have a lot of flex room in your character. In other words, you can be cooperative as a player without being cooperative as a player, yeah, without being wholly cooperative as a character. So let me give you an example. So let me say the party has decided to do some quest that's a rather noble and upright quest, and your character isn't that noble and upright. So, but you still, with your player awareness that you still have to cooperate with these other players. You still want to go along, otherwise you're just going to be sitting out. So you can say stuff like, well, I'm going to go with you just to prove how wrong you are. I'm going to show you this is a fool's mission, and you'll see that I was right all along. Even though you're disagreeing, your character is in a way not cooperating with the other players. You as a player are cooperating because you're going along with the quest, you're engaging them in conversation, you're maybe even sparking a conversation with your disagreement of how wrong they are, and they're going to try and say, no, you're the one who's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And you're engaged, right? That's really what matters, right? Everyone's got to stay engaged, right? So you're cooperatively still telling a story because you're having a conversation as the PCs are traveling to the destination.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a very interesting point. The fact is that in-character conflict, if it's managed correctly, can still add a lot of interest without completely destroying the sort of overall sense of cooperation you have in an RPG. Now, I wouldn't for 1 minute suggest that because we're saying cooperation and cooperative play is important, that every character should slavishly agree with the party leader or everyone should think exactly the same. Far from it. I mean, after all, most groups, whether you look at real life, television, films, role-play games, whatever, the groups are always more interesting because there's some friction or there's some conflicts between the characters. It not only adds like an element of drama to it, but it also makes these interactions seem more realistic. So let's face it, in real life, that there's no sort of group of people who 100% get on 100% of the time. But it's making sure that those conflicts are managed so they don't spiral out of control to the extent that it completely destroys any sense of party unity. And I think your example of the person saying, oh, right, well, I think you're making a mistake about this mission, but I'm going to go with you to pull your ass out of the fire. And then I can tell you, look, I was right, you were wrong, is a good example because you're still taking part in the game there, but you're still getting across the fact there's that friction between the two characters.
Yes. There's nothing, as a DM, there's nothing to be more boring than the get along gang. You know what I mean? It worked for the Musketeers, one for all and all for one. We all think the same way. That's boring in play because everybody is the same. Cooperation, like you say rightly, is not we all agree with every idea. I think we should negotiate with them. Screw that. We're going to kick down the front door, put an axe to his head, and make him tell us, right? You're having a conversation. You're engaged, right? That's all. That's the level of cooperation you need to have. You don't have. It doesn't have to be yes, 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 yes. Good idea. It doesn't have to be all that. As long as it's interesting and bringing everybody together, bringing all the players together, it works.
Well, apparently we've just had a note from Fantastic Dimensions, Ian, that he was just about to ask a question, and then you've just answered it, Rob, the second he started typing it. So it looks like we're getting ahead of the game there. We have got another question in where it's asking if cooperative role play is it conducive for the face-to-face tabletop experience rather than the online play? You know, due to you having more body language, etc., on display in face-to-face games. If so, how would you resolve that gap and that difference for the purposes of online play? So I think Tales from Another World is just trying to ask, does it have more immediacy? Does it have more impact in face-to-face games? And how would you bring some of that across into online gaming?
Okay, so I think that it's equally important in both. You want to have that engagement always in both. With online play, in my experience, there's a bit of a delay. There's a hesitation. Sometimes you get people stepping over each other. At a table, I can maybe me as the GM, I'm involved with a player in a scene or two players in a scene, and two other players can have a side conversation in character. You can't do that in an online game because you can't really have more than one person speaking. It just gets all. But so I would say that when you're doing it online, maybe you've got to be a little less subtle. Speak a little bit more plainly, make your point a little bit more clear. But otherwise, all the factors the same. In other words, the differences in playing online would apply to every aspect of the game, not just cooperation. You got to wait, give the person a little bit of a delay because there's a pause between them stop talking and you start talking. You can't have this side of conversations. The person is quite right. You don't have the body gestures aren't nearly as obvious. The camera doesn't pick up all the little facial expressions. So you have to be, it's a little bit more like a radio play, I guess, when you're doing it online. You got to be a little bit more expressive with your voice and your intentions. But everything else is still intact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously, if you look at online, I mean, you can see that much of the person. So you're talking like the upper half of their torso, their face, and their hands. And as you say, depending on the speed of your internet connection, how good your camera is, etc. It doesn't always pick up those nuances. There's delays, there's lags, there's people speaking over each other. Now, if you're in a face-to-face game and two characters are having an argument, there's no reason you can't be talking at the same time and shouting over each other. However, it's a lot more difficult to hear that sort of thing when you're all listening in headphones and you can really only hear the loudest person because it blocks out everything else. So I do think there are a few sort of things you have to bear in mind, a few sort of concessions you have to make when it's online gaming, such as giving people a chance to jump in, leaving gaps in your conversation for other people to take part in it. But I think you can still get a lot of that idea across by, let's say, being more expressive with your facial expressions, putting more emphasis on your voice, using your hands more, because obviously you can actually see them. Whereas if I was in a face-to-face game and was having an argument with someone, I'd be quite happy to jump up out of my seat and like shake my fist at them or whatever. Obviously, I can't really do that in an online game, but you can still shake your fist, you can still raise your voice, you can still get the sort of broad strokes of that idea across whilst still allowing other people to actually participate in it. I think you just have to bear a few things in mind like that.
Yeah, quite right. In my home game, occasionally I'll do things like I literally get up out of the seat and I'll be pacing back and forth as an NPC kind of thing, or I'll get up and I'll go right up to a player and literally get in his face, and stuff like that. You can't do that online, but you could compensate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was in a very good game at one of the conventions over here in the UK that Jenny was actually running from the RPG Brigade, and it was a sort of pulp Indiana Jones versus Nazi style Hollow Earth expedition game. And at one point we were all getting interrogated by, the sort of supercilious, smug Nazi commander that's so beloved of like many pulp sort of films and TV shows. And Jenny actually got up and was like pacing around the chairs when we were all sat in a circle doing the sort of interrogator walking around, sort of saying, all your plans are going to come to nothing. I've foreseen everything you're going to do. And you can't really do that. You can't really do that rightly, as you say, in an online game. But if you're the person who's managing the hangout, there's no reason why, if you want the attention focused on the interrogator, you can't click on your camera so you stay on the big screen, lean a bit closer into your camera, adopt the voice of the interrogator or whatever, and have the player's attention focused squarely on that person. It might not have entirely the same impact, but it's the nearest thing you're probably going to get in terms of an online game.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that's really all the differences in online. I mean, we could do a whole chat just on online versus offline play. It has its pros and cons, right? Briefly, the pros for me are that I get exposed. I get to play with gamers all over the world, such as yourself in the UK. If we had to do this face-to-face, we would never get the game together. I've played with players Denmark, New Zealand, Chechnya, South America, France. It's fantastic. But the disadvantage is all the ones we talked about: the delays, the hesitations, the lack of side conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. There are certain limitations to the media, as there are in any media. It's one of the things that always makes me laugh whenever you see a film that's brought out that's an adaptation of a book, and one of the complaints you'll often hear is, it wasn't exactly like the book, or they've changed a lot from the book. And I always think, well, that's because if they did it exactly the same as the book, it probably wouldn't work as a film, because they're entirely different media. They intersect at certain points, but they have their own sort of stylistic conceits that need to be taken into account. And I think it's very much the same with face-to-face and online role-playing. You have to take into account that they are different media, but there's a lot of different ways you can get similar effects using the two if you want to. And there'll be some things, of course, that you just plain can't do in an online game. Like we say, like standing up and pacing around, you obviously can't do that. But there's other things that you can do in an online game that you can't do in a face-to-face game. So as you were rightly saying, that you can game with people from all over the world, of all backgrounds. It's basically just as long as someone's got an internet connection and a microphone. Hell, they don't even need a camera, really. You can, although obviously that helps, you can game with all these different people. And it just gives you a wider pool of players to pull on, which I think, despite all the problems and technical hitches and stuff like that, still makes it a very worthwhile endeavor. And obviously the community, the RPG Brigade, who sort of led to the impetus of this panel taking place, wouldn't have occurred without online gaming.
quite right. What else we got to cover regarding cooperation?
Okay, so one of the things I was going to say is, what potential ways do you think there are of encouraging player characters to cooperate in a game? As a GM, is there anything you think you can do to like foster that attitude of cooperation?
Okay, 2 questions you asked me. So the first question is, why should I cooperate with players? Because, I mean, that's how you're supposed to do it. One of the ways to see almost any adventuring party from a character standpoint is, these are 4 people or 5 people that have to work together. Imagine you're doing some roadside job, digging a ditch, whatever it is, and you're thrown together with 3 other strangers. You have to get this job done with these other strangers. So you have to get along, i.e. cooperate with them to some degree, otherwise the task isn't going to get done. So yeah, cooperation is an absolute must. Now, what can you do as a GM? Well, there's a few things you can do. One thing is the types of quests you can give them. One thing I like to do is I like to bring in personal quests that are tied to maybe a background or something particular about one character, as well as quests for all. When you do the personal quests, I like to sprinkle them throughout the campaign so that throughout the course of the story, there's a focus on this character for a session or 2, and then maybe there's a focus on this character for a session or 2. And what that does is that makes each of the characters deeper and strengthens the bonds between the other characters, because they know about this tragic thing that happened in this person's past, or this really unusual thing that happened in this person's past. So when the characters know more about each other, it's easier for the actor player, i.e. the characters, to engage the other characters, to bring that cooperation in, to ask them stuff about personal to that character, you know what I mean, to kind of bring them into the scene. So I have another thing I'll tell you, but you go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I think a lot of it as well does depend on how much you view it being the GM's role to encourage people to cooperate in the first place. As we said earlier, we're talking about player awareness, as you call it. I think it's partly the GM's responsibility to help foster an environment where you are cooperating. And obviously this assumes a game that's built around cooperation. There are certain games where that's not the case, but assuming it's a game where you want cooperation to be taking place, the GM can provide quests, as you say, that encourage cooperation. He can pull on various aspects of character background to get them involved in quests. But I think as the players, you also have to take a lot of responsibility for ensuring that your character can get on with the rest of the group to an extent that they would want you to come along and help them on the quest. Because by doing that, so let's say you've got a player who his old mentor is in trouble and he's called on him to go and help them out, just to give a really stereotypical quest. You say to them, all right, the rest of the group, can you come with me? Can you help me out with this? I think it might be more than I can handle on my own. If you play a character who can go along with that and you can help them out, when it comes to the turn of the spotlight shining around to a quest that maybe involves your background, the other players will be far more willing to reciprocate and come and help you with that, because they know it's they're repaying the favor effectively for you helping and going out with their sort of background stuff.
Right. Okay, so on the topic of quests, the GM can give quests which are sort of designed to foster cooperation. Now, you could say that about every quest. You know, if it's fighting the big bad guy, okay, you get up there and punch him, and I'll get back here and shoot arrows, and I'll stand over here and heal, whatever. But I mean quests where everybody has a part. So there's millions of quests like this. I'll just give you a couple of broad examples. I ran a quest recently in one of my online games where the party had to ambush a group of people and get a book off of them. Well, the party knew that these people were going to be coming along a bridge at a certain time, but they had full freedom in how they wanted to set up this ambush. And so when you do that, the players will usually take it on their own to say, okay, assign each person sort of tasks within their approach. I'm going to be over here, and I'm going to be the decoy, and you be over there ready to catch the runners, and you stand back there ready to mop up any of the fighters who come at me, and you be over here ready with the spells. Everybody gets something to do, and better still, the cooperation really shines not when the plan is executed, but when the plan is being planned, when the players are discussing this plan and talking about different roles and things they could do for this ambush. It's fantastic to watch as a GM, because they're all literally cooperating. They're all throwing in their 2 cents toward the plan. I could do this. Hey, maybe we could try this, that kind of thing. And finally, they'll settle on a plan and execute it. So everybody gets to shine within the encounter, because they all have their own, and they all set it up. They did it on their own, right? I just said, ambush this group. How do you want to do it? And they take over from there. So that's really, it was easy, really, for me, and it's enjoyable to watch as well. And they certainly get to enjoy all the cooperation and reap the rewards of it. The plan worked more or less to plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I think another benefit of cooperation, which you sort of hinted at with your answer there, is that if you're just a single person and you're, say you've got to break into the patrician's warehouse to steal some occult artifacts or something, if you're just one person there, you've got a limited pool of ideas that you can draw upon to work out how you're going to plan that, how you're going to go through that. Whereas if you've got 2-3 other characters all contributing to that plan, you might suggest something and someone will be like, oh, but haven't you forgot the fact there's like 2 guards by the rear entrance? And you might have not thought of that. Or they might suggest other ways which you haven't thought of, which you can take into consideration when you're coming up with a plan. So it's that whole melting pot idea of the more ideas you put in and sort of sift through, the more likely you are to get something interesting and productive out of it. Whereas if you're just a single person, you've only got your one viewpoint and your one pool of knowledge focused towards that end.
Yes, we are, the sum of us is smarter than the individual totals, right? Yeah, we're collectively smarter. So quite right. And it doesn't have to be, like you said, the cooperation can be anything from help me carry this couch, right? I can't carry this couch by myself. But you can do cooperation in different kinds of quests. Like this cooperation can happen in all kinds of quests. So I suggested an ambush quest. But imagine a quest that's, say, part trap, part combat. So the players are in a room. There's some undead pouring in from one side of the room. And on the other side of the room, there's maybe some gas, necrotic gas seeping in that's only harmful to the living. So you've got a couple of players over there, maybe a thief and a wizard, trying to figure out and stop this gas from coming in, prevent it from doing whatever it's doing. And meanwhile, the bruiser types are holding off the undead, giving them the chance to do this, right? So this cooperation, you can foster it as a GM by designing quests that require the PCs to work together to solve it, right? It doesn't have to be a complex puzzle, but even the ambush is a puzzle in itself, right? How do you want to approach this problem? So you can think about that consciously when you're designing some of your quests. What can this player do in the quest? What can the rogue do in the quest? What can the druid do in this situation? And try to not exclude anybody. And by not excluding, you're being inclusive, and therefore you're going to get that cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the way games are designed, certainly things like D&D, etc., there's no one type of character class that is equally good at everything. There's no Superman class that covers everything. All the classes are meant to have their own particular area of expertise, their own thing that they cover and that they do better than everyone else. And now this might not be the case for all systems, but normally, even if you use like a points-buy system, you will not have enough points to make your character a Superman who's good at everything. You will have to either be a bit good at a few things, or more likely you'll specialize in one area and that'll be your main shtick. and then you need other people to fill in those other areas. So to use the example of like breaking into the warehouse, you might say, oh, well, okay, well, I'm the warrior, so when it comes to fighting the guards outside, no problem, I've got that sewn up. But hell, I'm not going to be able to pick the like really ridiculously complex lock on the door. That's not my thing, and if I force it, I might set the alarm off. But as you were saying, that's when the rogue can come in and say, well, I've got the thief skills, I can do that bit, and then once we get inside, someone else will take over, and it just gives you a wider talent pool to fall on to accomplish your goals.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the GM, knowing the different strengths and weaknesses of the characters, he can write quests, give them challenges where they have to work together. And the challenges don't have to be particularly complex, like some elaborate trap combat. They can be simply something like, climbing a cliff wall, right? Solo, that might be harder to do. All right, I'll get up here and I'll toss a rope down to you, kind of thing, and you can climb up. And oh shit, there's some harpies coming. We need someone to shoot off those harpies while this guy climbs. I'm falling. And then, maybe the wizard casts a feather fall on the person to save them. All kinds of cooperation can happen just in something simple as scaling a wall.
Yeah, entirely agree. Right, we've got another question coming from Chappie, it's a couple of questions, who says, what's your favorite techniques for... You're right there, Chappie. He says, what's your favorite technique for encouraging cooperative world building / character creation in a game? Is it joining character backstories or leaving blanks for other characters to fill in, as 2 examples?
That's a good question. One thing I like to do, I guess, is when I'm getting prepared to run a campaign, I like to have discussions with each of the players, sometimes individually, before the campaign starts. I give them some ideas about what they can expect, and I also ask them what kind of things they would like to do, what they would like to explore, they would like to see. And so you take the ideas from the player. You don't have to use them all, but try and use some of them and incorporate those ideas into your group world or campaign world. They can be ideas from as small as, oh, I'd like to ride a griffin, to, oh, I'd like to see, I'd like to visit the desert where there's caliphs and city-states and stuff like that. They don't have to be minor, they can be broad, and you can incorporate entire cultures into your world, or something simple as small as riding a griffin, or, as I mentioned earlier, something that's tied to the player's background. And so that's the player cooperating with the GM. And I'll touch on the second part of what he said in a minute, but you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I play a few games, Fate being one of them, where the sort of default system encourages people to have crossed paths in the past, like before the actual game started. Now, as a GM, I like to allow that, and I think it certainly can be very useful. However, it's not something I want to enforce and say, right, everyone must have met everyone before now. I think I like to leave that down to the players. If they say, oh, well, our characters have crossed paths before, it shows that they want to build up a bit of a sort of collective backstory, which is great as a GM because you can pull on that when you're doing your adventures. They've already got a pre-established connection, but it's not something I want to enforce and rigidly say that people have to do that. But on the other hand, I don't like to do the sort of stereotypical thing where you all meet up in a tavern at the start and you're given a mission or something along those lines. I think that's been done quite a lot, and it can be very challenging to make that sort of cold start interesting.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I really like those kind of meetings. I mean, I don't mean the cliche of being in the tavern. So I'll tell you one method I used that I thought was pretty successful is I had the PCs at the start of a campaign absolutely not know each other. They didn't know the person's race, class, anything. And they were on a tiny island, very, very small island. and they were individually exploring. This is the very first session, individually exploring the town, when it was attacked by pirates. The little village they were was attacked by pirates, and some townspeople came out to defend the town against pirates, and each of the players individually decided to join in the defense of this village. They fought off the pirates, and then afterwards they're kind of looking around at each other and like, hey, you did pretty good in that battle. And that started the ball rolling with them getting to know each other without this sort of like cold, hi, I'm so-and-so kind of introduction, right? They were brought together, but that was one way to make them cooperate. They all cooperated in the defense of this thing. They got some goodwill with some of the townsfolk who helped to defend the town, and that gave them a bit of an in with the NPC, so it jump-started a bit of reputation there. So I thought that worked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that it can also work well for bringing people together at the start is the sort of in media res style of starting a game, which I know there was a lot of discussion in the RPG Brigade a short while ago about that. For those who aren't aware, in media res is effectively just sort of starting in the middle of a conflict or a sort of high pressure scenario, and then after that's resolved, you then sort of work backwards and say, right, how did you arrive here? So just to give a random example, it might be a case of you start off the session with all, and this is something I sort of used when I was running my D&D campaign that Rob's playing in. I started them all off on a wagon train, which very shortly came under attack by bandits. And then you resolve that initial attack, and then you sort of work backwards saying, well, how did you come to be on this wagon train? Why were you heading there? And as a GM, you can ask a lot of leading questions rather than just sort of saying, right, how have your characters met, which is very open-ended, and a lot of people might struggle to actually come up with an explanation for that. Whereas if you say, okay, you're all on this wagon train, you're heading towards this town, why are you heading towards the town? How did you meet the wagon train owner? It's a lot easier having that frame of reference to actually come up with an appropriate answer, and you still end up at the same place. You've all on this wagon train, you've all taken part in this encounter, you're all thrown together by circumstance, but you've just established a little bit of background. And it also means that straight away in a game you can get into a very exciting, fast-paced scenario rather than having to start sort of fairly low key and then build up to the excitement. So I think that's one possible way that you can sort of get people together fairly quickly and then work backwards to fill in the details afterwards.
I ran a high-level mini campaign one time there where the characters were all pretty high level, semi-retired. I had them all figure out in advance what they've been doing since their retirement or semi-retirement. And then for the initial quest to get them all going together, instead of me reading this story, giving this, God voice overhead kind of thing to the group, what I did was with one player, I said to him, here's some information that you learn that is going to make you want to involve the other players, get their assistance in solving it. So I told it to him, and then when the session started, I had to say very little as the GM. I just introduced that one character. He described himself, and then he took actions. I received this letter from the king that stated blah, 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 blah. So I forget what it was, but he basically was the one who went around gathering all the other ones, and I thought that was a cool way to start the cooperation ball rolling, because it's this character who's doing it. It's not the GM sort of almost heavy-handedly pushing the players together, right? It worked out.
Yeah, I mean, I think another possible way of doing it is as a GM, because I'm a great fan of whilst I believe prep and GM sort of preparation is necessary for games, I certainly don't believe in doing unnecessary prep or making additional work for yourself that you don't need to do. So I think a good way of doing it is if you give the players an initial situation that requires their cooperation and a combination of all of their skills to resolve, then quite often they'll jump into that, and during that situation they'll establish a bit of chemistry between their characters through their conversations, etc. And in a way they sort of gel together as a group without really realizing it or having to have like a formal, yes, we are now an adventuring party, let us sally forth and deal with evil sort of moment. So I think that's a good possible way of doing it. But like I say, you do have to bear in mind that you need to set up a situation that requires the contributions of all of the people there. Whereas if you just say, right, it's just a straightforward combat, well, that's grand for the fighters and the paladins and whatever. But if you're some sort of swanky noble whose main sort of thing is that you're very socially adept, you're very good at moving through a different strata of society, you're probably not going to be involved in that as much. However, if you set up a situation where they're trying to capture those bandits and get some information out of them, you might have a situation where the fighters go out, they do their thing, and when they bring one of them alive for questioning, that's when the noble steps forward and has their moment, and they start bringing out all of their social flair to persuade the person to talk. And whilst they're doing that, like I say, they'll establish a bit of chemistry and they'll be working together already and sort of subconsciously forming a party and seeing the worth of other people without ever really realizing it or having to ratify it in any sort of formal sense.
Quite right. I want to give Cheppy a little bit more detail, particularly to world building. He was talking about cooperative world building, and I think when you're talking about that, you're talking about out of game cooperation or pre-game cooperation. And I think very much the same kind of rules apply to that you would have in standard improvisation. Take what the other actor gave you, respond to it, build upon it, things like that. So maybe one player in the world building suggests, oh, I'd like to see a desert adventure. And another player says, oh, that sounds cool. Maybe there could be some kind of genie running a city, or some sort of a freetie running a city. And then another player says, oh, maybe we got genies running one city and we've got freeties running another city, and there's a conflict between them. And then so each player is taking the idea of the previous one and building upon it, right? Altering it slightly, and then collectively they put together this sort of world, right? And that happens, that's out of character. That's strictly player-to-player cooperation, building a world that their characters can then go and explore in. And as you know from all the group world building you do with Fate, a big advantage to doing that is that when your players get to play in that world as their characters, they already kind of know something of the world, so it's easier to create characters to fit in that world. And they get the enjoyment and satisfaction of seeing their ideas brought to life. One of the things I do in my campaign, even though I prep like a madman for my campaigns, I might, in my list of needs, I might say to a player, and I did this, for instance, in my last couple campaigns, I said to a player, I need a fishmonger. Create me a fishmonger NPC. And I said to another player, I need a blacksmith. Create me a blacksmith NPC and find me a picture for that guy. And then they will create the character, the personality, and then I will bring them into my world. And if they interact with that character, I will do my best to role play it as they have described him. And so this is a different kind of cooperation. I'm glad Cheppy brought this up. Good idea. And so it's a different kind of cooperation, because then the players get the satisfaction of saying, oh, I created this, and there's the character come to life, right? I get to speak to him and stuff like that. They're certainly going to be more invested in the campaign because they have an interest in seeing their idea come to life.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point. And as you say, it's a very interesting question from Cheppy. I think the out-of-character cooperation, when you're doing something like collaborative world building, can lead directly to the in-character cooperation you have within the game. And it's also good for the GMs. For instance, if I say to my players, okay, what are the nobles like in this setting? And all the players are like, oh, well, we see there's lots of different houses and there's conflicts between them and they're warring against each other all the time. I know as a GM that the players are looking for sort of social maneuvering and perhaps military intervention from these nobles, and they want a very sort of cut and thrust sort of politic-y style of setting. Now, as a GM, if the players are saying to me, look, here you go, this is what we want in a game, then it'd be a bit silly of me as a GM not to actually use that. And as you rightly say, Rob, when you do bring that out, they don't only get the thing where they can go, oh, that's cool, I helped to create that, but it also gives them that background knowledge and helps to draw them further into the game. And as a GM, it helps set off the sort of prep that I'm going to do and set the direction that I can go in. Now, obviously, as a GM, you're going to put your own spin on that. You're going to put in a few little tweaks here and there to make it your own. But if the players are saying to you, this is the sort of game we're looking for, and you have any interest in it, I think, to be honest, you'd be foolish not to use it. It's a resource at your disposal.
Yes, and it's only going to make it better for the player who suggested the idea in the first place. Kind of an amusing thing in one of my games, Steve Fillmore, he created a cleric for me, and the cleric is kind of a dick. And he complains sometimes that the cleric's a kind of a dick. I'm like, you created him, you wrote him now. He's like, oh, I know, but he's still a dick. It's amusing to me. It doesn't just have to be characters too. It could be locations. You know, what is this inn like? Give me a name for. I might say to a player, I need a name for a river. I need a name for a mountain range. I need a name for a lake. Anything the players can do that they can then later recognize is going to be enjoyable to them. They're going to get a sense of satisfaction because you're cooperating with them. You're taking their ideas and incorporating them. I'll tell you a quick example. One time, the players started out this adventure, and then basically it started out with them just getting paid for a quest. And they had plans in the introduction. They had plans to go to some fancy bar to celebrate. And the player says, no, I don't want to go to that place. I look down the road and I see a tavern about 15 buildings down that has a sign that says the Red Flag, and there's a lot of worker types, you know, people who physically work there. I see them pouring in there. Those are more my kind of people. I'm going there. Right on the spot. He made that up. So I'm like, okay. So I'm scrambling quickly thinking of who owns this place, what's it like, da, 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 da. Basically taking the ball that the character gave. So that's a different kind of cooperation. That's a cooperation between a player and GM. And like we said, it's world building right within the session, right? I mean, that can still go on. You're not just limited to outside the session for that. So try to not say no to stuff like that as much as you can.
To give an example of that from a game that I ran, I was running a Dungeon World game, and we had the players one of the players said, oh, I think we should go and explore the forest over there. Now, we had the mage of the group who was quite sort of well-traveled, and I said to him, what rumours has your character heard about that forest? And he turned around to the other player and he said, oh, well, I've heard rumours that there's dragons nesting in that forest. We might not want to go there, or we might want to keep it a bit low key if we are going to. Now, as a GM, I wanted to keep dragons very rare in the setting. I didn't want them to be all over the place. But thinking about that, I was like, well, how would the sort of like the peasants where these rumours have come from, how would they know the difference between a dragon and a creature that looks a bit like a dragon to the uneducated observer? So I went for wyverns in the actual game. So I said, all right, well, what I'll do is I'll put like a nest of wyverns in that area. And later on, a few sessions down the line where they actually went to explore this forest, and they weren't attacked, but they saw one of these wyverns in the distance, and the mage could make his roll to go, oh no, that's a wyvern, it's not a dragon. The player was then able to go, oh, fucking peasants. They don't even know the difference between a wyvern and a dragon. What's the world coming to? And he felt great about that because his skills had allowed him to make that distinction. But it was still very obviously based on the rumor that he had come up with. It had just been expanded and tweaked in a way. So that was a great way of getting them all to feel involved. But by the same sense, they also used their in-character skills and their sort of cooperation as a group to find this out, to discover there was a little bit more to it than initially had been suggested by the rumor.
That's an excellent suggestion. Just a little add-on to that. As a player, not just as a GM, as a player, if you know that a character has a particular skill set, herbology, tracking, whatever it is, and you see a situation for that skill to be used, you don't necessarily have to wait for the GM to spot it. You can say in character to the other player, well, you know plants. What the heck are those? Are those poisonous, or can we eat them? You know, and bang, you're bringing the character in by using the knowledge that you have about them, and again, the good player awareness.
That said, I mean, if you look at it from a purely tactical point of view as well, by having an air of cooperation and getting to know the other player characters in your party, you become aware of what each person's strengths and weaknesses are. So if you're the person who the party looks to and says, all right, we need a plan to go in and take out this desert bandit lair or whatever, and you know that one of your people is a good fighter, one of you is a good scout, etc., you can say, like, right, well, we're going to have you to like lead this part of the plan, we're going to have you to do this part of the plan. Whereas if you don't really get to know all the other characters and you don't have that cooperation, you might not have a clue in your party who's suited for different parts of that sort of plan. So just from a purely tactical point of view, even ignoring all the other many good reasons for cooperating, it makes sense to get to know the other player characters. After all, you might be placing your character's life in their hands at certain points. And in real life, if you didn't know someone and you like just met them and you knew nothing about them, would you really want to say, oh, let's go into this hazardous situation and I'm going to place my life in your hands? Of course you wouldn't. Whereas if it's someone you know and you know they can handle themselves, you know they're good in certain situations, you'd be much more willing to let them take the lead under certain circumstances.
Yeah, quite right. Quite right.
I think that probably leads on to one of the things that's often referred to in role-playing games, which is the dangers of splitting the party during a session. Now, I don't know what your thoughts are on splitting a party during a session, Rob.
Well, I mean, I never want to say to the PCs, no, you can't. And there certainly are some times when it makes sense. But try not to, or if you're doing so, do so with a purpose. Like the example I gave where I said, you two guys go and question the witness. It was in town. There was guards with them. I know there was no real danger, so they didn't need us there as backup. So it was largely for the purpose of giving those players, those characters, the spotlight. You know, if you're in a safe town situation and one player says, well, I want to go visit the blacksmith to get the tears in my chainmail fixed up, and another player says, well, I want to go to the library to look up this book, this spell in a book, blah, blah, blah. That's perfectly fine. You're okay doing that. But be aware, both as a GM and a player, when you split up, that you can be reducing cooperation and stuff like that. So do it when necessary or when it's going to be brief or stuff like that. Try to minimalize it, right? I guess I'm going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. I mean, I think as well, if you look at it again from a sort of a slightly more analytical perspective, if you look at the sort of standard group of 4-player characters in a game, if you spend the entire session split up, like individually doing your own things, then really the GM can only focus on you 25% of the time because they have to jump to other people and give them a chance to do stuff. Whereas if you're all together, all 4 of you, then effectively you can be involved as much or as little as you want in 100% of stuff going on, because the spotlight is focused on the party as a group rather than having to jump to one person for a few minutes, then jump to another person, then another person. And of course, if they have to go through 3 other people before they get back to you, you're going to spend a lot of time cooling your heels, and you might be very interested in what's going on, but you're not directly participating. Whereas if the group of 4 people individually go to these 4 different places, you can be contributing to all of those encounters.
Yeah, I would say that one thing you should always be aware of, this again with the player awareness, is that it is an improvised game, right? So the rules of improvisation should often be foremost in your mind. And if you split the party up, if your characters are literally not in the same scene, they cannot cooperate together. They cannot improvise together. So again, you want to kind of minimize the splitting up of the party. Not to mention all the inherent risks that come with it when you're doing it out where there's danger and stuff like that, you know.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, if as a GM you've stat at an encounter that's sort of roughly appropriate sort of power level for the entire party, and then sort of the little halfling thief goes, well, I'm going to wander down that dark woodland trail on my own and see what's down there. Then in all likelihood, if he gets jumped by the group of ogres, he's probably toast, because there's no one there to back him up or to help him out in that situation.
Or maybe it's a Star Wars game and the guy decides to leave the party and go down there and investigate all the people that are coming in by himself. And then he winds up getting killed because of it. You know, that could happen.
Yeah, hypothetical situations like that.
Totally hypothetical, right?
Okay, we have another question in from Luke Gallagher, who said, when world building, referencing what we were talking about a moment ago, what aspects should he be most concerned with when it comes to world building? So what aspects do you think are most important in world building, Rob, when you're sort of creating a world?
Well, I don't mind answering this question, but we could do a whole hour just on world building. So I'm going to limit my answer, and we can do that another. I'm happy to do that another time with you if you like. But I'm going to limit my answers here to how world building applies to cooperation. And we've kind of covered this, but I'll try and add a few things. When you are looking for players for a game, let's face it, we all have very different tastes and styles, and it's all the whole smorgasbord. If you have players that their styles are too far apart, probably best not to try and force them together. If you've got a player who really likes the investigation and the talking with NPCs and the putting together of clues, and you've got another player who just wants Hulk smash, those players probably, if that's their styles, they're probably not going to get along too well. You're going to have your cooperation is going to be limited because of that. So when it comes to the world building part, at least the character selection for it, I would be a little bit particular in the kind of styles they want and the kind of players you're bringing together, so that you know you're going to have a good mesh. I know I could give them way more details on world building, but as I said, that's a completely other topic. That's another hour, so we'll do that another time.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I agree. So limiting it to the cooperation aspect, I think an important part of that is this out-of-character cooperation, when you get people together to decide what world you're going to do and what sort of themes you're going to have in your game. Since if everyone gets together and agrees that, oh, we're going to have a very sort of social game that's going to be about social maneuvering between different guilds, and then you run your first session and someone polls up and they're like, I've gendered a social outcast barbarian half-orc who can barely string two words together, but he's amazing with an axe. That character's not going to work within that setting. So I think getting people to cooperate together with you as the GM and with each other at the start, when you define the world and what the game's going to involve, is a good first start, and it can potentially save you a lot of trouble further down the line.
Yeah, and then when it comes to the actual world building, again on the cooperation aspect, just more to what I said. Really try and use the yes and approach, or maybe even yes but. As players, this is pre-campaign, as players, you're doing the world building. So when a player suggests something, try and take that idea and build upon it, or alter it slightly to merge with an idea you might have, as opposed to say, no, I don't want to do a desert, let's do a mountain adventure. Once the group was kind of zeroed in a little bit on an idea, try and make it like Lego. Right? Every piece just adds to what you've got, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to what we were talking about before we went on air, where a lot of that comes as well from people knowing what they actually want out of a game. For instance, if you're a player and you want a certain type of game and you don't tell your GM that, you're not cooperating enough with your fellow players and your GM to feel comfortable enough to say, right, this is a sort of game I enjoy, or how about we do this, then you haven't really got anyone else but yourself to blame if that isn't reflected in the final world. So to use the sort of hypothetical example of the sort of thick half-orc barbarian, then if that person had said, well, I was actually looking for a more sort of combative game, or something that maybe plays up the difference between civilized society and the wilderness and the sort of nomads, if they don't put that forward when you're all sort of cooperating in your session zero or your world building chat or whatever, you can't really then sort of complain or blame anyone else if that doesn't appear in the final world.
Yeah. Quite right. I hope we've answered that question enough. I know, again, we can get way more into world building, but we'll leave that for another one.
That's it. Well, Luke certainly said that he'd certainly be interested in watching us do a sort of full hangout on world building, something that's definitely something we can potentially look at in the future. So I think we've pretty much sort of covered the topic of cooperation. Is there any last words you'd like to say about cooperation in RPGs, Rob?
Sure. What cooperation ultimately comes down to is inclusivity. Try to include other players, other ideas, and even if your character, as we mentioned, even if your character disagrees with the other character, you're still including the other player in the conversation. So all the time when you're playing, player awareness, GM awareness, no matter what side of the screen you're on, try to be aware, oh, this player hasn't spoken in 10 minutes. How can we include him in our scenes, right? How can we get that improvisation, cooperation going on? So cooperation can often equal inclusivity. Don't get so wrapped up in playing your character that you lose that player awareness.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I mean, one of the things that is one of my bugbears when it comes to role-playing games is when you see people use the phrase, oh, well, that's what my character would do, as an excuse for disruptive or uncooperative behavior. Now, there are certain things where saying, oh, well, my character would behave like this is a perfectly valid thing to say. But I think within most character types, as long as they're not really narrow, sort of one-dimensional characters, you have a lot of leeway as a player to how your character can behave without having to step out of their persona. So even if you're playing like a brusque, sort of uncommunicative barbarian type, there's no reason that you have to never communicate or just grunt at the rest of the party or not get involved in anything they're doing. You might, when they say, oh, we're going somewhere and we need a bit of muscle, you might want to wade in simply to show that, well, your people are superior to these soft city dwellers. And even though you're doing that and you're portraying the disapproval of your character, you as a player and your character are still getting involved in that situation. You're still actually helping out the other player characters, and it's not cost you anything in terms of your character portrayal to actually do that.
Yeah, instead of, this is a waste of time, you're like, don't worry, Samuel, Rhaegar will protect you, right? That kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so I think that pretty much covers the topic of cooperation. We've talked a little bit about the benefits of it, the dangers of splitting your party, how you can encourage cooperation as a GM. We've touched lightly on world building, although we may do a future hangout, since that's a very expansive topic that we'd have to cover in a separate hangout or panel if we were going to do that. So I hope this has been useful. We did actually reach the dizzying heights of 6 viewers at one point during the hangout, which I think is probably a personal record for me. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Rob for joining me for this, and to everyone who has submitted questions and who has watched it so far. We hope to see you all in the future. So for now, we will close out this panel by saying goodbye and thanks for watching.